There is a version of Luca Dončić that the cameras catch the one pulling up from 30 feet with a defender draped across him, the one spinning through traffic in the third quarter of a game that has already been decided, the one walking to the free throw line with the calm of a man who has been in this exact moment 10,000 times before. That version is real, but it is not the whole picture. Behind it, running parallel to every dribble and every decision, was a private weight that most people in that arena could not have imagined. By the time the 2025-26 season reached its final stretch, Luca was not simply a basketball player trying to win games. He was a father separated from his daughters by an ocean and a legal dispute, a man who had been uprooted from the only NBA city he had ever called home, and an athlete whose body was quietly signaling warnings that his competitive instincts refused to honor. He was carrying all of that onto the floor every single night, and for long stretches of the season, he made it look effortless. That is perhaps the most remarkable and least examined part of everything that followed. The Los Angeles Lakers entered April 2026, holding the third seed in the Western Conference, and Luca Dončić was the reason. His numbers across 64 games were not the product of a comfortable man playing loose basketball in favorable circumstances. They were the output of someone using the court as the one place in his life where the variables were knowable, where effort had a direct relationship with outcome, where the noise outside the arena could not follow him past the tunnel. He led the entire NBA in scoring at 33.5 points per game. He was averaging 8.3 assists and 7.7 rebounds. He had strung together 13 consecutive 0-point performances through March a month when his personal life was simultaneously unraveling in the tabloids and in the courts. He said it himself, more than once. In the quiet moments between games, basketball was his therapy. The court was his peace. What that admission reveals is not weakness. It reveals the extraordinary psychological pressure that surrounded everything else. When a man of his talent describes sport as an escape rather than a stage, you begin to understand what the escape was from. And then, on April 2nd, 2026, even that was taken away. Ljubljana is not a city that produces NBA legends by accident. Slovenia's capital sits quietly in Central Europe, a place of cobblestone streets and alpine light, where basketball exists not as a cultural obsession, but as something closer to a craft pursued seriously, developed methodically, and measured against European standards that demand technical fluency long before athleticism is ever considered a shortcut. It was in this environment that Luca Dončić first learned the game, not on playgrounds defined by physical dominance, but in structured academies where footwork was corrected before shooting form, where court vision was treated as a skill that could be taught rather than a gift that simply arrived. He joined the Real Madrid Youth Academy at 13 years old. 13. He left his family, left Ljubljana, left the comfortable geography of childhood, and moved to Spain to compete against teenagers who were older, bigger, and had been inside that system far longer. Most kids in that position shrink. Luca did not shrink. He studied. He absorbed. He developed at a pace that made the coaches around him quietly uncomfortable in the best possible way. The discomfort of watching someone compress a decade of growth into a handful of seasons. By the time he was 17, Luca Dončić was playing meaningful minutes in the EuroLeague, the most demanding club competition in European basketball, against grown men who had spent years perfecting the craft he was still in the process of acquiring. He was not surviving those minutes. He was thriving in them. At 18, he was named EuroLeague MVP, became the youngest player ever to win that award, and led Real Madrid to a championship. These are not footnotes in the Luca Dončić biography. They are the foundation of everything that makes him structurally different from the overwhelming majority of NBA players. He did not arrive in the league as a raw athlete waiting to be developed. He arrived as a finished offensive system housed inside a 20-year-old body, a player who already understood angles, timing, defensive rotations, and the geometry of late-game decision-making at a level most players spend their entire careers trying to reach. The Dallas Mavericks selected him third overall in the 2018 draft. What they were actually selecting was a player who had already lived through more competitive pressure, more technical refinement, and more high-stakes basketball than most American prospects encounter in 4 years of college. That foundation never left him. It is the reason that even in the hardest moments of the 2025-26 season, when everything outside the court was fracturing, the basketball itself remained precise. Dallas gave Luca Dončić something that most young stars never receive: immediate organizational identity. From the moment he arrived in Texas, the Mavericks built around him without apology. The offense ran through his hands. The late-game decisions were his to make. The franchise accepted early in his tenure that the most productive thing they could do was remove obstacles rather than install systems, that the player they had drafted was not someone who needed to be fitted into a structure, but someone whose natural intelligence would eventually become the structure itself. Coach Rick Carlisle, a man not easily impressed and not naturally inclined toward deference, recognized it quickly. The relationship was not always frictionless. Luca's emotional intensity on the court, his visible frustration with teammates and officials, his refusal to mask competitive dissatisfaction behind diplomatic composure, created friction in moments. But the underlying arrangement was clear. This was Luca's team. Dallas knew it, the league knew it, and Luca, for all the turbulence of those early seasons, knew it too. He assumed that identity would be permanent. He assumed Dallas was the entire arc of his NBA career. That assumption was shattered on February 2nd, 2025, when the Lakers acquired him in exchange for Anthony Davis in one of the most structurally shocking trades the league had witnessed in years. Los Angeles presented an entirely different kind of challenge, not because the talent surrounding him was lesser, but because the context was denser and the expectations carried a different texture. The Lakers are not simply a basketball team. They are an institution with a gravitational pull that distorts everything around them, where the history of the franchise hangs in the rafters literally and figuratively, where every personnel decision is processed through decades of championship expectation. Luca arrived mid-season, mid-adjustment, in a city that had not chosen him the way Dallas had. He had been delivered there by a transaction, not a draft night promise. J.J. Redick, in his second season as head coach, was building something methodical and modern, a system that valued pace, spacing, and ball movement in ways that complemented Luca's instincts without ever fully replicating the freedom he had known in Dallas. The adjustment was real. Luca admitted his initial reaction to the trade was, in his own word, terrible. But adaptation is something he has always been capable of. It was, after all, the foundational skill he developed at 13 in Madrid. By the time the 2025-26 season reached its midpoint, the adjustment was complete. The Lakers were his team in every meaningful sense, and then his hamstring began to whisper warnings that the season was not going to finish the way anyone had planned. There is a particular kind of basketball intelligence that resists statistical capture. It lives in the half-second before a decision is made, in the moment when a defender's weight shifts fractionally toward 1 foot, when a help rotation arrives 1 beat late, when the geometry of 5 moving bodies creates a window that exists for less than a second before it closes forever. Most players at the NBA level can identify these windows after they open. Elite players can identify them as they are opening. Luca Dončić identifies them before they exist. He sees the defensive structure that is about to form and positions himself to exploit the gap before the gap has materialized. This is not instinct in the casual sense of the word. It is the product of 15 years of structured basketball education, compressed into a mind that processes the game at a pace that makes his physical limitations, and he has them, by NBA standards, almost entirely irrelevant. He is not the fastest player on the floor in any game he plays. He is rarely the most explosive, but he is almost always the most prepared for what is about to happen next. And in basketball, anticipation is a form of speed that no combine measurement has ever found a way to quantify. What made the 2025-26 season particularly revealing from a tactical standpoint was watching how Luca operated within J.J. Redick's system while simultaneously operating above it. Redick's offense was designed around movement, around using screens and spacing to generate clean looks for shooters, a modern, analytically coherent approach that trusted the process of shot quality over individual creation. Luca honored that structure in the way a master musician honors a key signature he played within it. But he also knew instinctively when the composition required improvisation. His 8.3 assists per game were not simply the byproduct of having good teammates. They were the result of a player who understood defensive tendencies well enough to manipulate them deliberately, who could hold a defense in one configuration with his eyes, while his hands prepared to deliver the ball somewhere else entirely. His 33.5 points per game existed alongside that playmaking, not as a contradiction, but as a complement. The threat of his scoring created the passing lanes, and the threat of his passing created the scoring opportunities. Defenses had no clean answer, because there was no clean answer to give. Stopping one dimension only fed the other, And Luca had spent his entire career understanding exactly how to make that trade punishing. By March 2026, that understanding was operating at a level that left analysts reaching for historical comparisons they could not quite complete. The first warning came in early February 2026. Luca felt his left hamstring tighten during a stretch of games that the Lakers could not afford to lose, and he missed 4 contests right before the All-Star break. The medical staff managed it carefully. He returned after the break and played through the residual discomfort with the same quiet stubbornness that had defined his relationship with physical pain throughout his career. Luca Dončić has never been a player who treats his body as something fragile. He plays through soreness, through swelling, through the accumulated damage of a season that asks enormous things of a frame that carries more weight than the prototypical NBA star. Dallas fans had watched this pattern for years: the grimace, the limp toward the bench, the locker room exit that looked final, followed by the return minutes later as if nothing had happened. It became almost mythological in its repetition. The problem with mythology is that it can cause the people around a player to misread genuine distress as familiar theater. And the problem with a player who habitually plays through pain is that when the pain becomes something serious, the signals look identical to all the times the pain was something manageable. That is the trap that closed on April 2nd, 2026 in Oklahoma City. The game itself was already lost when it happened. The Thunder were winning by a margin that had rendered the final quarter meaningless in competitive terms. Luca had felt something in the first half, a tightness, a familiar whisper from the same hamstring that had spoken to him in February. The medical staff evaluated him. They cleared him to return. Coach J.J. Redick, operating on the available information and on the reasonable assumption that this was another episode of manageable discomfort, sent him back out. Then, with 7:39 remaining in the third quarter, Luca drove toward the basket, planted his left leg during a spin move, and the hamstring that had been warning him for months finally gave way completely. He grabbed the back of his left thigh. He limped toward the baseline. He sat down and did not get up to play again. The MRI conducted the following day in Dallas, the city where his NBA story began, confirmed what the moment had already announced: a grade 2 strain of the left hamstring, a partial tear of the muscle fibers, a recovery window of 4 to 8 weeks, depending on how the body responded. It was the same hamstring, the same leg, the same muscle that had already been compromised once that season. When the same structure fails twice within months, the medical calculus shifts entirely. This was no longer a maintenance issue. This was the body presenting a bill that the season had been running up since February, and the total was higher than anyone had hoped. The version of Luca Dončić that exists in the public imagination is built almost entirely from highlight footage, the step-back three, the Euro step through contact, the no-look pass that arrives at a teammate's hands before the teammate has finished deciding where to be. What that footage cannot show is the infrastructure beneath those moments, the hours in the gym before the arena fills, the film sessions where defensive schemes are dissected, not for general awareness, but for specific exploitation. This center hedges 2 steps too far on the pick and roll. This wing loses his assignment for exactly 1 beat when the ball swings to the corner. This team's defensive rotation breaks down consistently on the second side of a drive. Luca has always been a student of these details in a way that separates genuine basketball intelligence from mere talent. Intelligence without preparation is potential. Intelligence applied through relentless preparation is what produces 33-point weaving. If weaving cannot stop them, the unseen hours are the reason the visible moments look inevitable. Nothing about what Luca does on a basketball court is accidental. And that truth only becomes clear when you understand the volume of deliberate work that precedes every game. What made the preparation demands of the 2025-26 season uniquely brutal was the context surrounding them. Luca was not arriving at practice facilities and film sessions from a place of domestic stability and emotional calm. He was navigating a custody dispute that stretched across 2 continents, managing legal proceedings in both Slovenia and Los Angeles simultaneously, processing a family separation that had become public in the most intrusive possible way, and doing all of this while being expected to perform at the highest individual level in the NBA every single night. The psychological energy required to compartmentalize that volume of private turbulence, to walk through a tunnel and become, for 2.5 hours, purely a basketball player is not something that can be measured in minutes, logged, or shots taken. It is a form of mental discipline that most people will never be asked to demonstrate at that scale. And yet, the preparation never visibly suffered. The film work continued. The shooting routines continued. The physical maintenance work on a body that was already carrying a compromised hamstring continued. There is something in Luca Dončić's relationship with preparation that functions almost as a psychological anchor. The routine itself becomes the stability when everything outside of it is shifting. The court was his peace. The work was how he kept it that way. LeBron James turned 41 years old during the 2025-26 season. That fact alone is worth sitting with for a moment. He was averaging 21.8 points and 6.9 assists per game at an age when most professional athletes have been retired for nearly a decade. Doing it on a foot that had required management through February, doing it alongside a co-star young enough to have grown up watching him play. The dynamic between LeBron and Luca was never going to be simple, because nothing involving LeBron James at this stage of his career is simple. He arrived in Los Angeles years ago as the unquestioned center of everything, the decision maker, the closer, the gravitational force around which every roster and coaching decision orbited. Then the trade brought Luca, and the organizational hierarchy shifted in ways that required a different kind of maturity than winning ever does. Accepting a secondary role is not something legends do naturally, but what LeBron demonstrated throughout the season was something more nuanced than mere acceptance. He became, in the truest sense, a force multiplier, a player whose experience and court awareness made Luca more dangerous, whose willingness to operate without the ball created the spacing that Luca's game requires, whose presence in clutch moments provided a secondary option that defenses could never fully ignore. When Luca went down in Oklahoma City, LeBron's response was 6 words: health is wealth. We'll see what happens. 6 words from a man who understood the situation completely, because the same rule that was erasing Luca's awards eligibility had already erased his own. The relationship that shaped Luca's season in subtler but equally significant ways was the one with head coach J.J. Redick. Redick arrived at NBA coaching without the traditional pathway, no long assistant coaching apprenticeship, no slow accumulation of institutional credibility through years in the system. He came from analysis, from media, from a playing career defined by the kind of specialist excellence that requires a deep understanding of spacing and movement without ever requiring the ball-dominant creativity that Luca embodies. That gap in experience could have created friction. Instead, it created something more interesting, a collaborative dynamic where Redick's analytical framework and Luca's instinctive genius found a functional synthesis. Redick was secure enough in his own intelligence to trust a player whose basketball IQ exceeded his own in certain dimensions, and Luca was professional enough in his approach to honor a system that occasionally asked him to defer in moments when his instincts said otherwise. Beyond the coaching relationship, there was the quieter human architecture of teammates who watched Luca carry his private weight through the season without making it a public spectacle. Austin Reeves, whose own offensive emergence earlier in the season had briefly suggested the Lakers might have genuine depth, understood implicitly what was being asked of the team around their star. The unspoken agreement in that locker room to perform, to support, to not add to the noise was itself a form of relationship that the cameras never quite captured. March 2026 will exist in NBA record books as a statistical anomaly, a stretch of basketball so concentrated and so consistently extraordinary that the analysts tasked with contextualizing it kept arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion. There was no clean historical comparison that held up entirely. 13 consecutive games with at least 30 points. Multiple nights above 40, several eruptions past 50 that emptied arenas of their noise and left opposing coaches staring at clipboards as if the answers might materialize from the paper. Luca Dončić was doing this while leading the Western Conference Player of the Month, voting by a margin that was not close, while simultaneously managing a custody filing that had become front-page news, while nursing a hamstring that had already failed him once that season, and while carrying a Lakers roster that was entirely dependent on his production in a way that left no margin for off nights. The 1-3 game streak was not the product of a player who had found some new gear or unlocked some previously hidden dimension of his game. It was the product of a player who had decided, consciously or otherwise, that the court was the one place where the world outside could not reach him, and who channeled everything that world was throwing at him directly into his basketball. Decode any individual game from that stretch, and the intelligence behind the numbers becomes visible immediately. His scoring did not come from volume shooting or from the kind of issue accumulation that inflated numbers hide behind. It came from efficiency 47.6% from the field across the season, a figure that becomes more remarkable when you account for the difficulty of the shots he was taking and the defensive attention he was receiving on every single possession. Opposing teams were not giving Luca Dončić open looks in March 2026. They were sending double teams, changing defensive schemes at halftime, switching their most athletic defenders onto him in the fourth quarter, and doing everything that modern defensive coordination allowed. None of it worked consistently because the intelligence operating behind his decisions was processing defensive information faster than the defenses could update their responses. When they doubled, he found the open man before the double arrived. When they switched, he exploited the size mismatches with a postgame that most perimeter players spend careers trying to develop. When they played him straight, he pulled up from distances that should not be efficient and made them efficient through a combination of shot-making ability and the psychological weight of a defender who knows that closing out too hard means getting blown past. Every option the defense chose fed a different part of his arsenal. That is not a hot streak. That is a complete player operating at the peak of his completeness. The scoring title was virtually certain. The All-NBA first-team selection was, by any reasonable measure, beyond debate. The MVP conversation, while crowded with legitimate candidates, included Luca as a genuine contender fourth in the final media straw poll, trailing Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Victor Wembanyama, and Nikola Jokic, but present in the conversation in a way that reflected the weight of what he had produced across 64 games. And then the hamstring tore, and the 6'5" game threshold became the frame through which an entire season was suddenly being evaluated not by its quality, not by its historical context, not by the extraordinary circumstances surrounding every minute of it, but by a single integer. 64 is not 65. That is technically true. It is also, in the context of what Luca Dončić produced and endured during the 2025-26 season, a profoundly incomplete way of measuring anything meaningful. The numbers that the stat sheet captured were staggering, but the numbers that it could never capture the emotional weight carried into every game, the psychological discipline required to perform at that level while a family dissolved across an ocean, the physical courage demanded by a body that was signaling distress long before it finally surrendered, those are the figures that define what the season actually represented. Legacy is a word that gets deployed too casually in sports conversation, typically to describe things that have already been resolved and require only celebration rather than examination. What Luca Dončić's 2025-26 season represents is something more unsettled and more honest than legacy in that comfortable sense. It represents a player at the absolute peak of his powers, in the middle of the most turbulent personal period of his life, producing basketball that the league had rarely seen at that sustained level, and having the institutional recognition of that production denied by a rule that was designed for an entirely different problem. The 6'5" game eligibility requirement was introduced to address load management, to push back against the practice of healthy players sitting out nationally televised games for rest. Luca Dončić did not sit out games for rest. He played through a compromised hamstring. He flew to Slovenia for the birth of his daughter and flew back 2 days later to play. He absorbed a trade that uprooted his entire life and responded by leading the NBA in scoring. The rule caught him not because he was avoiding the game, but because the game and everything surrounding it had taken a physical toll that one muscle finally could not absorb. What the numbers never captured is the gap between what the rule was designed to measure and what it actually measured in his case. That gap is where the real story of this season lives. There's a particular kind of unfinished story that resonates beyond its immediate circumstances, one where the outcome remains genuinely uncertain, where the variables are too numerous and too human to resolve cleanly, where the ending has not yet been written and the people closest to it cannot yet see its shape. Luca Dončić's 2025-26 season is that kind of story. The hamstring will heal, grade 2 strains, managed carefully and rehabilitated thoroughly, do not end careers. The 4 to 8 week recovery window means that a playoff return is possible, perhaps even probable, though the timeline and the condition he returns in remain the kind of unknowns that no amount of optimistic framing can responsibly eliminate. The Lakers will hold their seeding or they will not. The extraordinary circumstances challenge filed by his agent and the NBPA will succeed or it will not. The awards voters will find a way to recognize what he produced, or the rule will stand as written, and 64 will remain one short of the number that changes everything. All of those outcomes are still in motion. But the thing that is not in motion, the thing that the 2025-26 season established, with a permanence that no ruling or recovery timeline can alter, is the portrait of who Luca Dončić is as a basketball player and as a human being when the conditions are at their most demanding. What echoes forward from this season is not primarily the scoring title or the winning streak or even the cruel arithmetic of the 6-5 game threshold. What echoes forward is the image of a man who used a basketball court as the last stable surface in a life that was shifting beneath him in every other direction, and who performed on that surface at a level that demanded the attention and respect of everyone watching, regardless of what they knew or did not know about what he was carrying. His daughters are in Slovenia. His body is in recovery. His awards eligibility is under review. His team is holding a playoff seed with 5 games left and none of their most important players' minutes available to protect it. The unfinished quality of all of it is not a narrative weakness. It is the most honest thing about the story. Luca Dončić is 36 games into what will likely be a long and decorated playoff career with the Los Angeles Lakers. He is a player whose best basketball, by almost every analytical measure, still lies ahead of him. The 2025-26 season will be remembered not as the year everything went wrong, but as the year that revealed, under the most unforgiving possible conditions, exactly what he is made of. 1 game short of a number, an ocean away from his children, and still, somehow, the best player on the floor every single night, he was able to walk onto it.